Background is mostly in aerospace. This is a rendering of what I'm proposing as a flying car that would be very viable for what I want to do with it, which is travel through the air and travel across the ground. This makes sense. I'm an aviator. Most people that die in crashes die in bad weather because they shouldn't be flying that day. And a lot of times it's because they perceive that there's no option to flying in bad weather. You go somewhere when it's really nice, you spend a couple days, the weather gets bad, and then you die on the way home. So that's a very simple case to be made for flying cars. And this is one which I'm proposing to be a great racing machine. It's very simple to license as a vehicle on the road. It's got 3 wheels, which makes it a motorcycle, so you don't need child protective seats and things like that. And I'm also proposing using an electric motor in it. This is Larry Page from Google. He has a couple of flying car companies. This one is Kitty Hawk. They're flying right now in Lake Las Vegas area. 10 simple motors. They're flying over the water because if the motors quit running, if there's a battery failure or motor failure, they're going to fall in the water and not on the ground, which would be devastating. They also have another one they're using in called Cora, and this one they're flying in New Zealand. So the thing is that you're going to start seeing flying cars everywhere. Well, the question is, well, what's a flying car? In my perception, and I'm early enough, I get to make the rules, is that something that flies and also something that drives on the street. These guys are just very much focused at this point on kind of a hummingbird approach where they can take off vertically, much like a helicopter, and they're very focused on selling rides or selling vehicles to people. One of the primary rules of aircraft development is that airframes should follow power plants. If you have a really good engine or a good power plant, then you build an airframe that will accommodate it and make the most of that power plant. This is a vehicle that Augusta Westland did back in about 2011, I think. They kept it under wraps till 2013. They're a substantial helicopter company, and they do the tilt rotor ospreys as well. But with this one, they wanted to have something that was very futuristic, and so they developed the airframe, but there was really no power plant. There were motors that would run it. This thing ran with electric cable on it, because they're basically saying it's not our fault that this thing doesn't work, it's the battery people's fault, because they haven't come up with a good enough battery yet. So my position is, look, you guys have come up with some really fantastic batteries, and as an airframe developer, our job is to make airframes that work with what your power plants are. Thomas Senkel's a guy that famously flew a yoga ball with about 20 quadcopter motors on it. Fast forward, they went and took it into production with a company called Volocopter, and they did a classic thing where they stuck 2 seats in there. So here's a guy who's alone on a yoga ball, great, you know, he's flying his yoga ball, but then as soon as people start to commercialize things, they tend to add extra seats and say, hey, we need to make this reasonable, we need to answer to a market that nobody has ever proven has existed. So anyway, what I did, this is back in 2005, I started with a motorcycle engine because A, they pass smog, which is really important. You can't do that with a Cessna engine. So I said, look, motorcycle engines are getting so powerful that most people can't even use them on the ground for what they're worth. You can go 180 miles an hour on a street bike for 10 grand. Most aircraft engines were developed back in the 1930s, and they are certified into airplanes by those designs, and you can't change them. So back in the 1930s, there were no smog restrictions, so a Lycoming engine or whatever, these plane motors, they just simply aren't going to pass smog today. So I said, great, let's start with smog rules, and I kind of took a white paper design, and I used the gyroplane rotor system, which is basically, it's a passive helicopter, where once the wind hits it, the blade spins, and you get to take off. And these are very low cost. A gyroplane, I have one, they're like $20,000 aircraft, and they'll do what a $400,000 helicopter will do essentially by traveling to the air with a couple people. So the machine you see there on the right, that's flying back in 2005. Up on the left, that's a couple years ago. I showed it at a motorcycle show because it's weird. And on the lower left corner, you see the bane of my existence, which is my transmission. So I ran the entire airplane through the propeller, which has a lot of advantages, but it has some mechanical challenges as well. And also to take the power off of the powertrain has a lot of work. So probably don't need any sound on this because I plugged in the better. They stuck some videos together. But here's my freaky machine. This is a 2-seater. So I had some business investors, and they said, oh yeah, you got to have 2 seats. Everybody's going to want 2 seats. I'm like, well, who's everybody? So anyway, I built this machine, and of course it couldn't work. By the time you had a second seat, there's 180 pounds of people. It's a bigger motor. The thing runs great. It's a fantastic street bike. I mean, if I had to go to New York, that's the way I'd go. You can see in the center I have a propeller. This is a great kind of system for gyroplanes because it actually balances out the pitch moment really well. I weigh about 170 pounds, and so does the engine. So we have a lot of pitch stability, which is a good thing to have in a gyroplane. Because the engine's off the shelf, it's only a few $1,000s. If something happens to fall off, the propeller will blow it out the back, etc. So it was a design that we built, it's something we patented, and then I took it about as far as I wanted to go. And then guys like Richard and Zero Motorcycles and these other people started showing up and were like, hey, wait a minute, this electric thing has found itself to a level of maturity where I can now look to abandon these now becoming archaic, although high-performance motorcycle engines, and start switching to an electric solution. And that has substantial advantages where the reliability is amazing. Sometimes with your gas engine, it doesn't mean just because you took off with a full tank of fuel that the engine is going to survive till the end of the tank of gas. But I think the electrics, it's a much more reliable system. So this is just a quick overview of how the gyroplane works. So again, just you push the power from the center, and then the wind hits the rotor blades. It's actually very it's a power sucker. These things are great for maneuverability. They'll land in a very short distance, was an early objective. But then you go beyond that, the range is extremely limited in a gyroplane. You have a lot of power density, obviously, in a gasoline tank. But so moving forward, I wanted to switch to something that was that had wings. So this is an early flight of the flying motorcycle. So again, this is Richard and a lot of other people that were bringing their bikes, Brahma, which is now apparently Cummins, and Zeros, and we live nearby them. So the Zero motors, I gave you the engine weights a minute ago. It's about it's about 38 pounds. The batteries also. So it's easy to start working this in, and especially if you go with one person, it's going to be a lot safer and a lot simpler. One of those motors you just saw from a Zero bike, a guy named Mark Byerly, simply gutted it and put it into one of his aircraft and started flying this plane about, I want to say, probably 5 years ago, and very reliable. Another guy named Eric Raymond, he's been flying, he's done cross-country flights with aircraft using solar panels. This is one he gets about 12-hour flights consistently. He's flying mostly in Italy, and so the solar panel technology is now good enough, around 25-28%. You're getting 1 watt per gram off of these solar panels. So hello, the biggest reason people don't fly airplanes today is because they can't afford the gas, okay? Including me. So you're looking at $100 an hour to fly a plane. If you do it with electric, now you're down to $1 an hour. Very substantial, and the maintenance is a fraction of the maintenance required. So the general aviation manufacturers 10 years ago were saying, hey, in the future, for the next 10 years, we're looking at 1% negative growth for propeller aircraft. That's a dire prediction for an industry. I think the reality is that because you're making these batteries and the motors that are being bound into them, you're going to look at a really substantial revolution in aviation. Quick little background. So I started developing jet engines. I used to build them. So that the one on the trike there, I made all that stuff. And back in '84, I helped build the first private manned rocket ship, which was designed to carry a person to space. It was originally funded by Evel Knievel, and then we sold it to Naval Research Labs. 20 years later, I was a judge for the X Prize, which helped kind of usher in a lot of the private space stuff you're seeing. And then you've seen that bike already. So that was the one that flew was my first motorcycle I ever had. This is my second one. So the thing is, I try to do things that are a little bit farther forward than maybe where the industry is, so I have a good kind of opportunity to get away with it. I also ran Craig Breedlove's land speed team, so we were 0 to 715 seconds, but it would cost us about $50,000 each time we ran the car for 90 seconds. So we had 60 sponsors. One of them you should notice is AutoZone, so they had a $79 battery that we did have in the car, and we charged them a couple $1 million to put it there, so you can think where that's going, right? Anyway, so that car was pretty good at running, and then we helped build 3 rocket planes for Rocket Racing League. The idea being, again, getting into motorsports, that we were going to develop these aircraft and sell them and race them. Reality was there no installed base of those rocket engines or planes, so that company was a failure. Fast forward to now, I'm proposing we're going to do some flying car racing. I'm going to start it out in Los Angeles area. We'll do about 30 miles flying around the desert. You land your aircraft, and then you have to drive about 300 miles into Las Vegas. There's going to be 3 simple categories, probably batteries for the drones, and I'm going to have a lot of people, I see drones as kind of gateway drugs for kids who want F-16s, so I want to let them develop their own flying cars designs, bring them out and race them. There's Thomas Senkel on his electric vehicle. I'm going to do an electric class, which will be specifically battery powered. And Thomas was a guy that flew the yoga ball. He quit doing volocopters, and now he's got that simple machine. And the one that you saw on the bottom was like a 70-year-old flying car. That's the installed base. Also, Terra Food. You can order the bottom one with a web click. I think it's like 72 grand, and you can get yourself a flying car. So those are the people I anticipate will be coming out. It'll be sort of like a gentlemanly race. This is the latest thing I have. I kind of abandoned the bikes. I'm now doing propeller testing with batteries. I'm making an aircraft called the Street Wing. One person flies, drives. You put solar panels on there and a battery, and you can effectively fly and drive the rest of your life with almost no maintenance and no fuel. You're not going to buy any fuel. And I'm doing this as kind of an open source project. As I'm doing the data, I'm going to be disseminating it. It actually just went into structural engineering starting today at a nice firm called Structures.aero in the DC area. They do a lot of aircraft. So that's me, and that's what I'm doing. I'm bringing flying cars into racing because they have never been raced. I don't care if it's a tennis racket or a race car or a motorcycle or a pair of Speedos. They have competed, and that's how the development happened. And no one's ever raced a flying car, but you're going to see flying car racing before you get a chance to buy one. Thank you very much.